Thanks for coming by. This is the first podcast of the University Center of Excellence, Interacting Minds, Societies, and Environments at the Nicholas Copernicus University. This is a series of podcasts, blogcasts, webcasts we're doing about the different postdocs that we have here. This project is part of a series called Inventing Knowledge, which will be an ongoing thing. In this project, there are lectures. Each one of our postdocs will give a lecture. They will write a blog post, and then they will also be coming on here and having a little bit of discussion with me. I'm Brett Buttliere. This is Michael Pleyer. He's the first postdoc. He did his PhD. He got it in 2019 at the University of Heidelberg in Germany. He is an evolutionary linguistic theorist, according to his website. And his PhD was titled The Everyday Use of Pretend in Child Language and Child-Directed Speech, a corpus study. We will ask him a little bit about this in the process. He's working with Professor Sławomir Wasowicz. Probably I said that wrong, and he's working on a project titled Determining the Impact of Language Evolution Research on Language Sciences, Methods, Terminology, and Mindsets. So, Michał, thank you for being with us. Please, if you want to say hi.
Hi.
Yeah. Tell us about your work. I mean, tell us about the history of your work. Tell us about your PhD. How you came to be at the UMK.
Right. Okay. So that's quite a lot. Where would you like me to start with which of these things?
What are you working on? What have you worked on in the past?
So I'm an evolutionary linguist and a cognitive linguist. Basically, that means I'm interested in the evolution of language, so the evolutionary origins of language. How did language evolve? Where does it come from? And cognitive linguist means I'm interested in cognition, like the cognitive foundations of language. And within cognitive linguistics, my kind of main research track is language acquisition. How do children learn language? And in my PhD work, I focused on this research track, and I looked at language acquisition from a cognitive perspective, and specifically I looked at pretend play. So play where you pretend something is the case that isn't the case. So, which is very everyday behavior, like, you have a banana and you pretend it's a telephone. And my interest was in, like, how do children and caregivers talk about that, and what kind of linguistic mechanisms do they use, and what do they kind of pretend about as well, to kind of get an insight into the cognitive development of children along with their linguistic development, and how this is expressed in interaction. So that's my PhD work. Focusing on first language acquisition. And
how is it expressed in interaction?
So in my PhD work, I'm mostly focused on so-called explicit ways of making pretend evident. That means you say, I'm pretending. So, or let's pretend that. And one thing that's happening very often, for example, is that especially for children, especially when they don't communicate, it's not quite clear what they're doing.
Yeah.
So what you'll kind of caregivers often do is that they comment on and try to interpret their child's behavior. And so very often they would say, oh, are you pretending to do this? Are you pretending the doggy is sick? And so forth. And as children grow older, they become more and more explicit in their own ways of negotiating and talking about pretend play. And the scenarios they kind of create get more and more complex. So that's one of the very interesting things when we look at kind of the development of pretend play, is that it's at the beginning very much structured still by caregivers and interpreted by caregivers, and as children grow older, they become more of directors and give more and more instructions and kind of are more explicit about what is happening. And that's of course, also very fascinating insight into how children's minds work and how they kind of co-create and negotiate perspective.
So as the children develop, they begin to be able to express what they're pretending, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah? And use the language that they're learning to do that.
Yeah.
That's a one sentence kind of, or was there? I don't know. Did I understand?
No, that's I think for very general.
Yeah.
Like the interesting thing is that's something that's like happening socially as well. So kind of as children grow older and kind of acquire more complex linguistic mechanisms of kind of sharing perspectives with others and kind of creating meaning in interaction. That's kind of the interesting thing there, and that happens in pretend play, for example, as well.
And how did that kind of lead you to the UMK and the projects that you're doing here?
Right. So, as I said, my second research track is language evolution, and basically always has been. So, kind of language evolution is something I've been basically I developed a passion for as an undergrad, and then kind of became more and more interested in kind of this kind of question. And my perspective is that of cognitive linguistics, as I said, like so stressing like the relationship of language and cognition and asking what happens cognitively when we use language. And it's a so-called usage-based approach as well, meaning I'm interested in actual language usage, interested in interaction, and interested in how basically interaction influences how we learn and use language, and basically how cognition and usage and language interact. And this kind of perspective was not very well represented in evolutionary linguistics.
Okay.
So my question basically was, there's a famous saying by linguist Ray Jackendoff, and he says, your theory of language evolution depends on your theory of language.
Yeah, I read that actually in one of your
papers. At that point, there hadn't been a lot of people from cognitive linguistics or from basically this usage-based approach asking the question, what would a theory of language evolution look like if you assume this theory of language or this approach to language, like a cognitive linguistic, like a usage-based approach? And that's basically what I have been doing, and what I kind of have looked at in my work on language evolution is asking, okay, if we take basically this cognitive linguistic approach, which kind of focuses on kind of cognitive mechanisms, it doesn't see a strict separation between like language and cognition, but sees them as integrated, which focuses also on interaction. What does that mean for a theory of language evolution?
Do you think, I mean, you talk about language and cognition together, of course, and interaction together. Do you think that there would be a language if there was no interaction? So a person who lived alone, they wouldn't have a language, right?
Yeah, it's like, obviously we don't know, right?
Well, I think we do. I mean, there wouldn't have.
So
there would be no language if there.
What knowing means, like we haven't tested it.
Yeah. Okay.
Specifically,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Right. But generally, the question is what language is for, and how we use language. I would say, yeah, without interaction, there's no language, because there's no need for communication.
Yeah.
So I would agree with you on that. Interaction drives kind of the need to communicate and the need for language.
Yeah. Language for communication. You were talking about usage-based. Please. What were the three that you were saying? Cognition.
Well, yeah, cognition, language, and interaction basically are the things that kind of are most kind of interesting from this kind of perspective. If you are a cognitive linguist or a usage-based linguist, and looking at kind of actual language data and how people interact. So generally, kind of the role of interaction is something that I'm very much interested in turn with lots of research in evolutionary anthropology and on social cognition, showing that kind of interaction is kind of one of the key things in a way that makes us human, and that
Yeah.
also is of course important for all social species in general, and asking like, okay, so humans have a special form of being social, and language is kind of one expression of that, one part of this special way of being social, and that's kind of what I'm interested in. So you asked how this kind of led me to UMK, right?
Yeah.
To the university. So I so evolutionary linguistics, or the language evolution community, is they have two big conferences. They have the EvoLang, just the Evolution of Language Conference, which takes place every 2 years. And I went to the first one in Japan. So my first one, it wasn't the first one. My first one in Japan in 2012. And that's actually where I met my PI, or my PIs, so Sławomir Wacewicz and Przemysław Jakutinski, for the first time. And the other conference is the Protolang, which also takes place every 2 years on kind of alternating. And the Protolang was essentially developed and founded by Przemek and Sławek. And that's something I also went to. So if you are interested in like language evolution, if you belong to that community, then those are the two conferences you kind of go to, and that are kind of the medium for exchange and networking. And through that, I got to know kind of Sławek quite well and Przemek quite well. And so we already had a kind of and then we found with like natural interest in certain things, in kind of looking at language evolution. And when I saw that there was a postdoc position in this project, I applied, and because we have kind of lots in common, like as an evolutionary linguist or somebody who's interested in the language evolution, it's kind of very natural to kind of apply for a project in the EVO group of the university center. That is affiliated with the Center for Language Evolution Studies.
And what is the project about?
So the project is about the following. It's about determining the impact of language evolution research on language sciences, meaning that language sciences, that's what all the kind of typical like linguistics and sciences about language, kind of the mainstream view. So these are basically the things that kind of you would say, okay, what is what a linguist does? And then we could we look at language change, at language acquisition. We also look at the structure of language, the sounds of language, kind of the way that kind of words are put together to form sentences and so forth. And that's kind of a research strand that, of course, where like a lot of things are of important. So you need psychology of language. You need obviously like descriptive linguistics. You need data from lots of different languages, so language typology. And what about language evolution? So research on language evolution. How does it impact, and what effect does it have on kind of language sciences and kind of theories in language sciences as a whole, of what grammar is, how sounds work? And one particular part that I'm interested in, so language evolution research is very interdisciplinary, right? It's not just linguistics, but biology, neuroscience, primatology, archaeology, genetics, lots of different fields that are relevant. And as people who do kind of the language sciences, and then, for example, they write introductory textbooks, and in introductory textbooks, you basically, that's kind of what you learn as an undergrad, as this is the field. right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Yeah.
So same within any other field, right?
Yeah.
So if you have like an economics textbooks and then you do something like neuroeconomics, for example, then you're like, but it's not really in the introduction, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's a part of economics clearly,
Yeah.
and as neuroeconomics becomes more important, then you would expect also to influence kind of what's in textbooks and kind of what is kind of economics proper. Same for psychology, right? So the question is like, what belongs in there?
Yeah.
And probably like 20, 30 years ago, you would not have a chapter on evolutionary psychology in a psychology textbook because it was still something that was like more out there. Nowadays, if you look at psychology textbooks, you would say, yeah, that's something
Often,
that's often, right? It's often, so it's a development, right? And we're looking at basically language evolution as a field has become bigger and more advanced, more theoretically sound, and there's a lot more research now. And so what we're asking is like, how does this impact basically? How does this enter into the mainstream of what kind of language science is?
Yeah.
And in one project, for example, we're doing at the moment, we're simply looking at so what do introductory textbooks say about language evolution? Because there's like very classical things that a lot of introductions to linguistics start with animal communication, for example.
Yeah.
And then they start with these very famous experiments where non-human great apes like chimpanzees or gorillas, people try to teach them something like a sign language. So something based on American Sign Language, but not really American Sign Language.
Yeah.
But like an artificial communication system, and that's something that like is very popular, and you will hear about it in kind of in most introductory textbooks. But what else? Because that was in the 60s and 70s. What about the new research? What is featured? And that's kind of what we're interested in, like what kind of new research and how is the field reflected in introductions, and also how could that change? So what should be in there, what isn't at the moment.
And so you are looking historically through textbooks. Is that true, you think? Like looking through...
So currently we're looking at the most recent edition.
Maybe you can look like a different, how they change.
That would be the next stage, right? Yeah, that would be the next stage in like the research project.
Yeah.
That would be interesting. So right now, basically, we're saying what is it like now? So to basically immediately kind of say, okay, these things are misrepresented. These things are good. And maybe also kind of give guidelines with respect to, this is repeated again and again, but there's the thing is very often if all fields are very broad, and meaning you have to know a lot of stuff, so you can't know everything. But that also, I don't know if that's something that you sometimes also notice, that if you read like a general textbook, and it comes to your area of specialty, then you're suddenly like,
that's not so good. Yeah.
That's not so good.
Yeah.
And then of course the question is like, okay, I'm not a specialist in all the other areas they talk about, but that's of course something with, first of all, talking about things in generalities, and because you cannot be an expert in everything.
Yeah.
But that's something, of course, to look at, kind of just what's kind of the mainstream view of certain topics, which topics are left out, and kind of what should be added in terms of like the most, like the really exciting stuff that has been happening, especially like in the last like 20 years, for example.
I wondered, what would you say are the most exciting things that have happened in the last 20 or 30 years?
Right. So I think it's kind of two main things. One thing is that we know a lot more about social interaction and cognition in non-human animals.
Mm.
So we have basically, so in the field of evolutionary anthropology, we have lots more knowledge about both kind of the cognition and behavior of, for example, our closest evolutionary cousins, so the other great apes like chimpanzees, but also animals in general. And that's kind of a very, very exciting research part, kind of especially like unraveling the complexities of communication in non-humans.
Mhm.
Non-human animals is something where
Yeah.
there was a lot of progress. And the other is, in terms of language evolution, that it has become increasingly experimental
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
kind of more thorough. So we now, for example,
Oh.
have different experiments. Basically, we now can study like language evolution in the lab
Mhm.
by basically having kind of, participants learn like an alien language,
Mm.
and then have that language kind of being transmitted to the next generation, and then having that learned language transmitted to the next generation.
Mm.
So basically having kind of, we call it an iterated learning paradigm, meaning languages kind of get transmitted from one generation to one generation, and then we can see how they change, and also how maybe like an unstructured kind of communication system actually in the transmission process becomes more structured.
Mm.
And this is like really
Okay.
exciting,
Yeah, it sounds interesting.
where kind of there's lots of different research projects, because you can do that, for example, with different modalities. Like, what about like, for example, now you have to communicate gesturing when you don't have like a gesture system, or you have to communicate kind of using pictures and so forth, like drawing pictures, for example. So that's like one really exciting avenue, is these more experimental approaches to language evolution. So these would be like the two main things that I find are like really interesting, really cool developments in the last like 10-15 years.
Yeah, sounds cool. Sounds cool. You mentioned animals have communication. I think we agree on that.
Mhm.
Do they have a language? Would you say that they have a language?
Well, so obviously for that we would need to. So the question is, what is language, right?
Yeah. How are they different? I guess.
And so from a linguist perspective, I would, say, okay, language is too human, too complex to be defined by only one discipline. But most kind of things, when we talk about language, we say, okay, it's something, it's kind of, I would say, kind of a structured network of constructions of form meaning pairings,
Yeah.
that can be used to, that then have a number of features.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And normally, kind of when we say a language, we mean a structured communication system that can be used to talk about everything. So
Everything.
it's creative.
Okay. Yeah.
So that is structured in a very complex manner, where kind of, the things are related to each other. So this is the definition of language, and compare this with the definition of flight, for example, in biology or physics, right? Flight is something that's very specifically defined.
Okay.
Now, my question would be: can a sugar glider fly?
It would depend on the definition, of course.
Right.
Yeah.
If I say flight is self-propelled motion that catapults you into the air and lets you stay there for kind of lets you stay there as long as kind of your muscular activity,
Then it would be no.
lets you, then it would be no, right?
Then it would be no.
And of course, sugar gliding is really cool.
But if I say being in the air,
right,
then of course it's flying.
Yeah. But if I say kind of flying is something where actually kind of in most definitions we would say no. Like if you have a parachute and you're gliding somewhere, you're in the air for a very long time, and maybe you can even get from A to B.
You're not flying.
You're not flying, right? Yeah. And we wouldn't say like a sugar glider can fly. but birds can fly. It's similar with language.
Yeah.
From kind of a linguist definition of language, we would say no. Other animals, non-human animals, don't have language because they can't do certain things with it, or they don't do certain things with it. Like they don't have, for example, unlimited and potentially unlimited expressive power. So we can talk about unicorns, so things that don't exist. As far as we know, of course, that's something. Of course, if I say they can't, I mean, the data we have, the evidence we have, means we have no system. We have extremely complex communicative systems, but they're not kind of language. I'm kind of now talking about like qualitative differences, right? They can't do this. And that's, of course, one way of looking at it. Like similar to flight. There's flight and there's gliding, and maybe there's language and there's communication.
Yeah, that's what I was.
Or there's and language, of course, is a form of communication.
Yeah. I was wondering, do different groups of monkeys have different languages? Like, if they make the same sound, does it mean different things? Or do they use different sounds? I would assume so, yeah?
So I would say communication systems, of course, right?
Yeah.
Because, because a language means it's a very complex system of conventions and kind of and that are socially learned, for example.
Yeah.
And so for most non-human animals, most communicative signals are not learned. Although, of course, we have learned signals, but a lot of them are innate. So they are born with it. So the example that's very often used, vervet monkeys are an African species of monkey, and they have 3 different alarm calls. One for eagle, one for snake, and one for leopard. And they show behavior when they hear the alarm call that kind of indicates that something is happening kind of cognitively, that lets them to expect something. So if they hear snake, they kind of stand up and they look at the ground, for example.
But those are not socially learned.
Right.
Those are genetically determined.
Right. So they are produced without learning in infants, and so in baby monkeys, they automatically produce them.
Those sounds or the meaning?
Right. So they produce the sounds, they produce the calls, and they produce them in response to particular events. However, there is something that's called usage learning. They still have to fine-tune it. So the eagle alarm call, for example, a baby monkey would emit it to everything that's happening above. So they see a pigeon and eagle alarm call. They see some leaves falling from a tree, eagle alarm call. Then they kind of have to and then they kind of, they fine tune, and there's some amount of kind of social learning involved. But it's not the same in terms of that, we have a word like table, and
babies produce table.
We wouldn't naturally produce like something like table, and then we just have to learn kind of what exactly a table refers to. So that's kind of one of the differences. We have kind of social learning in chimpanzees, for example. There's some gestures like kind of a pick-me-up gesture that's probably ritualized from kind of, I try to be picked up, I try to climb onto you, and then that kind of gets reduced. And so at one point, kind of trying to climb onto you just becomes this, and then it already kind of, it means, okay, pick me up. That's a ritualized and learned gesture, and we have these, but we have lots more of them in kind of human languages, and very often they're kind of learned by convention, for example. So like kind of abbreviating something, kind of the process of ritualization, is still different from learning an entirely new word. Of course, the interesting thing that you kind of mentioned now is again, do we talk about this like qualitatively? Do we say they're fundamentally different, or quantitatively? So saying it's a matter of degree. I would say that in essence it's a matter of degree. So kind of following kind of Darwin here, saying that it's a matter of degree, but so essentially language is not something that's fundamentally and absolutely kind of different, but it's kind of on the same degree of other complex communication systems. But at some point, kind of we just call it language. The boundaries are a bit fuzzy, but so far the animal communication systems that we would talk about, we wouldn't call them language. They're just very fascinating, very complex communication systems that often have some structure, but not in the degree that we kind of, as linguists, for example, would call it a language, because that's something that's still even kind of more complex, more structured. Maybe one thing that I would argue, or that's often argued, is that even maybe asking if they have a language is not really the right question. Because the question basically is like, what do humans do, what do non-human animals do, and how are they different? Like, there's a nice quote by Mike Tomasello and his research group. They published a paper and they said that saying that only humans have language is a bit like only humans build skyscrapers. That's definitely true. Yeah. As far as we know. Yeah. But it kind of hides the fact that humans are the only primates, at least, that build freestanding shelters at all. So there's something underlying kind of our skyscraper building, a very fundamental cognitive ability, and that's the real difference, or kind of the more interesting difference. And the same can be said for language. So asking kind of, do they have language, do they not have language? A more productive question would be, what are the fundamental component parts of using a language, knowing a language, and to which degree are these aspects shared with other animals, other non-human, so with non-human animals? And that's kind of something I'm also very much interested in, and that's kind of an interesting question, because then we kind of then we say, okay, are humans the only species who use language? Yeah, but are they the only species who use credit cards, or kind of build skyscrapers or form nations? Yeah, they are. But what's kind of what are the underlying kind of cultural and cognitive behaviors that actually lead to these things? And that's something we can also ask for other animals, and it also leads us to have kind of a more meaningful comparison.
Okay, I would say personally, I mean, I don't know. I think it's a matter of degree. I mean, I would say humans make skyscrapers, yes, but don't bees make like beehives? They're not freestanding.
And then, of course, then you can talk about talk about ants and termites, for example. They have very intricate structures,
but they're not made out of steel, so they're not. Yeah, they don't have skyscrapers.
And then you have bowerbirds, for example, these Australian birds who build these very intricate nests where they take lots of stuff, and that's why it's probably more interesting to look at similarities of structure and the underlying cognition. Yeah. Because then if we talk about bees, we see that kind of the way it is actually done is very different. And when we only look at the product, that obscures very often the fact that the underlying mechanism and actually the structure of the thing can be quite different. And so that also means, and that's why kind of general distinctions are not that not that useful. We should look at kind of more specific kind of things, and then compare kind of structures, and very often also kind of compare the underlying kind of cognitive behaviors, for example.
Another thing I was thinking was Chomsky. So you were talking about kind of innate language. I don't know Chomsky that well, but my understanding is he's about some sort of genetically determined innate language things.
Right. So
it's some evidence for it, yeah. So when a monkey or when a bird, the specific bird that you talked about, or the monkey talks about this thing that it does that's above it, and it makes a certain call, that's some evidence for Chomsky, no? I mean, I would say.
Well,
what do you think?
So, lots of things to unpack here. So, first of all, kind of, I should say, innate, of course, isn't a very good word.
Yeah.
Like if we look at, for example, evolutionary developmental biology.
It was your word, though.
Yes, okay. I know. So I'm guilty of using it, and I think I use it as a shorthand.
Yeah.
Meaning, kind of, there is a very kind of complex cascading process. Sometimes we would say maybe genetically channeled. There's something in our biology or in biology that kind of influences the emergence of this behavior.
It would, like the structure of the voice box, for instance, or
right,
like maybe the way that when they look up, their voice is a certain way, and then they just push some air out, and it makes a certain call, for instance.
But maybe even like in terms of like a brain development, for example.
Okay.
But what I mean is like brain development is a very complex process, for example.
But Chomsky has evidence, or he doesn't have evidence?
So first of all, what do we mean by innate? Okay, we mean, there's some genetic basis, some biological basis for a behavior, right? So now, innateness is something that there's like a biological kind of foundation for something, is that's very obviously true in many regards. Like, a frog cannot speak.
Yeah.
And the frog also sees differently. We cannot do like echolocation in the same way as bats. Yeah. We cannot smell in the way that dogs do.
Yeah.
And this probably has something to do with biology.
Genetics.
Yeah, genetics, right?
Yeah.
And so in that sense, like innateness is obviously true.
Yeah.
In some sense. And everybody kind of agrees on that. For example, with regard to humans, there's something biologically special about us, as there is about every animal, right?
Yeah. We have thumbs.
For example, we have,
which allow us to write.
Yeah.
And over time, develop more complex language, maybe.
That's one thing, right? We can also, our brains are different, and all the brains are different. So obviously, it's something in our biology, right, that makes things different. Yeah. So, and it's also something basically in our biology that enables us to learn language, and that's something that basically kind of everybody agrees on. Mm-hmm. We are biologically prepared for learning, for example, language. Mm-hmm. Now.
And that's a memory function, or that's a processing function, or a RAM function?
Right. Now we're getting into the thing where it gets more complicated.
Yeah.
Because now we ask, okay, so what does this mean? So Michael Arbib, for example, a neuroscientist, calls it the language-ready brain. Mm-hmm. We also, of course, have a language-ready body to go along with it, like you talked about the voice box, and there's, or for signed languages, the manual modality.
I think writing is one of the most. We've talked about this, but I think writing. Other animals leave signs in the environment. They maybe pee on things, or they rub their antlers on things, but they don't write. They don't write books, and I think that's a very important. part.
Yeah, so writing, of course, is interesting, but what we have to think about is that writing only emerged in the last 5,000 years.
Yeah.
And when we look at archaeology, for example, the signs of cultural complexity and cognitive complexity that we find in the archaeological record is already mind-bogglingly complex.
Okay.
So,
Some examples, please. Some examples.
So tool use, for example, complex tool use.
Yeah.
I don't know if you know the Schöningen spears, for example, which are I think they're like 350,000 years ago, years old.
Yeah.
Google that if it's not right.
Yeah.
And they're kind of incredibly complexly made because they have like they have a spear tip made out of particular material that you actually needed to melt at a specific and you need it's glued onto a spear. There's like a metal kind of point of the arrow, and it's glued to the spear with the glue needs to kind of boil at a particular temperature.
Mm-hmm.
So fire, for example, that's a complex cultural technology.
Sounds good. Yeah. All right, so let's change gears now. We're going to ask you some questions about the NCU. How did you hear? Okay, you already kind of answered this, but how did you hear about the NCU? I think we do it anyways. Okay. How did you hear about the NCU? And what made you come here? Why did you want to come here?
Okay, so I heard about the NCU because I'm very familiar with the Center for Language Evolution Studies, which forms basically the EVO group of IMSERT. Yeah. Because my PIs, so Sławomir Wacewicz and Przemysław Czewiczynski, they are very active in the language evolution community. So they, for example, they organized the 2018 Evolution of Language Conference here in Torun. And as I said before, that's kind of the main conference for all people from language evolution, where they come together. And that's why basically kind of in the evolutionary linguistics community, the NCU basically is known through the work by this research group. Okay, and then when I heard about the call for papers, that was kind of why I knew I wanted to apply there, because it's kind of the known quantity in language evolution research.
Interesting. That's very good. Very good. And what has been your experience? So what was the hiring process like? How was your onboarding process? How was the process of getting a residence permit? Anything like this? And how could it be improved?
So, good question. So generally, I think, what you have to say first is that everything's a bit different at the moment than it would be usually.
That's true.
Obviously, because like moving here in a pandemic and then in the worsting pandemic was probably very, very different than it would have been usually. And that also kind of influenced how you kind of come to be here and then kind of get more comfortable and stuff like that. No, but so all my colleagues were very, very helpful. So things like getting insured and kind of other things, I always had help from my department. That was very nice. In terms of improvement, I think something like a checklist or welcome package where you're told more explicitly these are the steps you need to take, and that's how to do it. That would be something I'd appreciate, because I got a lot of help with kind of individual things, but kind of finding out what are all the things that you need to do. When do I need to get a PESEL number, for example? What do I do about kind of this and that? That's something that
I agree.
Mhm.
I think we're working on it, but I definitely agree that there could be more structure.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
think as a university-wide, there must be some department at the
Yeah.
university that has already a welcome packet. Maybe we
Yeah.
can expand it or something.
So like, you know, if you ask people, then they're super helpful and they
Yeah.
help you with everything. But sometimes there are some things where you're not quite, you didn't know that you should ask because you didn't know that was
Yeah.
a thing that needed to be done.
And there are also things I think that they don't know because they're not foreigners. They don't have to do certain things.
Yeah.
You know,
Mm.
that I think, so we're working on that. I think that could be good. Were there main struggles? I mean, what were the main struggles? How are there? Yeah, it's not that clear. I think we've already answered it. But what were the main struggles that you had as a foreigner? I guess meeting people in a pandemic.
Yeah, mostly, you know, the pandemic and you know, some of the things that are like going to the doctor, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Because first of all, you have to kind of know. There's always things that you don't know, right? And that work differently. You come from a different cultural background, so you have this unspoken assumption it's going to work the same way,
Yeah.
but then it kind of doesn't.
Yeah.
But
What would you say were the main differences, for instance? As you're a German, you're from
Mhm.
Germany. What would you say? I mean, that's maybe a difficult question, but I mean, what were some of those things that you didn't expect?
the healthcare system is different, which was kind of a difference. So that in, you know, Poland, for example, it's, you know, much more common that you pay for your doctor's appointment privately
Okay, yeah.
to get like an early appointment.
Okay.
That you would never do that really in Germany.
Okay.
But then kind of that also means you don't have to wait as long as you have in Germany, and then it's cheaper here
Okay,
than
yeah.
in Germany. So
Yeah,
there's
yeah.
different things. But so pharmacies work a bit differently. That was one thing, like in a pharmacy, when they don't have a particular medication, they just say, we don't have it, you need to go to a different pharmacy.
Yeah.
Whereas in Germany, they would say, yeah, you have it, you know,
In a few days.
no, mostly actually like in the evening or
Okay,
you know,
yeah.
the next day.
Wow.
And just knowing, kind of not knowing these things.
Mhm.
Then of course, like in terms of infrastructure, digital infrastructure, Poland is so much better than Germany.
Yeah.
Uh,
I don't know actually.
in Germany, actually, sometimes you still have some
Yeah.
shops that don't take card.
Yeah.
And here you have, you know, things like Blick where you can like pay with card really without a problem, and also that you have like a digital patient file here in Poland.
Yeah.
Like you don't have that in Germany. So it's, you know, these kinds of things where, for example, there's some things in the that are very, very different,
Yeah.
and then there are
In
things
a not good way, and some
in,
things are
like
in a
not
good
good way.
Yeah, yeah.
Like,
You can
oh,
say.
what do you mean I have to go to a different pharmacy?
Yeah,
And then in a good way, what do you mean I can kind of, you know, just pay this ticket with, you know, my phone and stuff like that, or much easier.
Yeah. Cool. Anything else you want to add? Any final comments?
Well, thank you for having me, of course. And
where can we find out more about your work?
Oh, yeah.
I have a website?
I have a website, which is myname.com.
Yeah.
I also am on Twitter, #symbolic storage, where I tweet about science, and I do live tweeting when I go to conferences, which people told me they like. So that's things. Yeah, but check out my website. All my publications are there with preprints. And I'm really kind of, you know, enjoying kind of being here.
I think it's also great. I've also really enjoyed my experience. Let us say that.
And also like generally being here at the, you know, at UMK. And it's
Torun is a beautiful city, I would say.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
So I would love to kind of see more of it once the pandemic is kind of curbed.
Yeah.
Curbed.
Yeah.
But yeah, those are final words. Do visit Torun. It's a beautiful city, but only visit it, in like a year or something.
Right.
But do visit it and check out. The uni is also a cool place to work because it's very exciting.
Yeah.
Because kind of with a new project. With these new projects like the insert cluster, for example, that's super exciting because they are very driven of kind of making Poland more visible in terms of research, putting it more on the map, kind of internationalizing Polish research, and that's, I think, super. And we see it like having
why we're doing this.
More, and that's something I find really, really cool, and I also really enjoy being part of this kind of this attitude of starting something and kind of really shaping something as well, which is really, really cool, and that's why I that's like my final thing to say.